class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 11 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the New Jersey Devils, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2 in the shootout. So the first shootout of the season for the San Jose Sharks, and their first shootout loss of the season. Unfortunately, this one comes a single day after the news of William Eklund going back to Sweden came out, because it would have been very exciting to see William Eklund perform in a shootout for the San Jose Sharks, but it is not to be here, and they end up dropping the extra point to the Devils, who actually tied this game up in just the last couple of minutes. So the Sharks end up finishing their 5-game homestand with a record of 2-1, and considering the quality of competition, this may not have been a great look for the San Jose Sharks if you were looking at it, 10 days ago and I told you the Sharks were going to go 2-1, but considering the circumstances that the Sharks have had to deal with on this homestand, a 2-1 record, which of course is a .500 record, actually isn't all that bad. Now, this first period started off scoreless, but certainly not for a lack of trying from the San Jose Sharks. They managed to get 3 posts in this first period, 2 of them coming from John Leonard, but neither of them actually managing to go in the net. The Devils themselves also had some strong opportunities that James Reimer was up to the task of saving, and so after 20 minutes, it was a 0-0 game. Moving into the second period, finally some scoring started to happen as the Sharks started to take a bit more control of this game. They would get the first goal of the game coming from Rudolfs Balcers after a great pass from Mario Ferraro to make it 1-0. However, just a couple of minutes later, the Devils would manage to tie the game, and it would be a 1-1 score at the end of 40 minutes. So we came into the third period. The Devils were on the final game of their California road trip here, so they were looking to try and win this period. The Sharks were on the final game of their 5-game homestand before heading onto a tough road trip, so they were going to try and win the third period here. And in the end, it ended up being quite even, at least on the scoreboard. The Sharks would get the first goal of the third period from Jonathan Dahlen on the power play to make it 2-1 San Jose, and then would kind of go into full turtle mode, which would almost work, but in the last 3 minutes, a rookie mistake from Ryan Merkley in front of the net would allow the Devils to get the tying goal from Kuokkanen, and we would then head to overtime, and after a scoreless 5-minute overtime, we'd head to the shootout where the Devils would win. The Sharks' only goal scorer in that shootout would be Logan Couture, and then Balcers would hit the post and Hurdle would get saved by Jonathan Bernier. Meanwhile, the Devils would have Jesper Bratt just barely score on James Reimer, as well as Damon Severson get the glove side top shelf shot off, and it would end up being the 2-1 shootout victory there for the Devils, and the 3-2 general in the game victory for them. Moving on to the lineup, as we have the first line here for the Sharks. This was kind of a polar opposite game than what we were seeing earlier on in the season for the Sharks. Early on in the season, it was the first line pulling all of the weight for the Sharks. Meyer, Dahlen, and Couture were absolutely unstoppable, and the other 3 lines were kind of just not really doing anything, not really pulling their weight in those games. Here tonight, the bottom 3 lines for the San Jose Sharks actually looked rather solid throughout this game, and it was actually the first line for the Sharks that was just an absolute disaster for San Jose. If we take a look at the first line, Couture and Dahlen obviously kept together as a duo, but who ended up filling in that hole left by William Eklund as he was sent back to Sweden? Was it an actual winger like Barabanov or Balcers? Was it someone like even John Leonard stepping into the lineup? Was it a different rookie like a Nick Merkley coming into the lineup? No, it was actually third line center Nick Bonino. If you're confused about this lineup decision, you're not alone. I have zero reason why this ended up being the case. Nick Bonino is a perfectly fine third line center, but he's not a particularly good first line winger, and proof of that, if you needed any, is the fact that Nick Bonino right now on the season sits at a grand total of 0 points on the year. And so if you were expecting this line to do much of anything offensively, you would end up being wrong, as it was just absolutely terrible. They were hemmed into their own zone, and you would expect at the very least that this line with Couture and Bonino, who are both very solid 200-foot players, would be able to actually, defend at the very least. Not really the case. So Couture's worst game of the season, I would say. I don't think it's particularly close. Dahlen, you could also say that about him as well. And then Bonino, I can't necessarily blame him a ton, kind of thrust into a role that he just doesn't belong in, but hopefully this lineup doesn't stay the same moving into the next game on Tuesday, because, as I said, It was terrible. On to the second line with Balcers, Hertl, and Barabanov. I felt like all three of these players were sort of separately quite good. I didn't think they brought a lot of cohesion together as an actual unit, as an actual line. I mean, if you were to compare it earlier on in the season to Couture, Meier, and Dahlin, who were just looking like a well-oiled machine, as if they were three players working together as one. Here tonight, that didn't really feel like the case between these three players, but they were all three of them good enough separately that it ended up looking like a pretty effective line for the Sharks. Balcers looked good, Barabanov looked good, and Hertl looked pretty good as well. Definitely a step up at the very least from the previous game against the Blues, though still nowhere near the level that he managed to reach in that game against the Buffalo Sabres a couple of nights ago. Where I felt like the Sharks really shined was actually in their bottom six, which was rather impressive. So, of course, there was a hole at the third line center position as Bonino was inexplicably moved up to the first line with Couture and Dahlin. So Weatherby ends up filling in on the third line center role and did so quite admirably, was joined and flanked by wingers Cogliano and Nick Merkley. And this was a very effective line for the Sharks. Offensively didn't get a ton generated, but defensively I thought was very, very responsible. Cogliano continued to show his tenacity. Weatherby, I felt like read a lot of the defensive plays very well, which is actually in stark contrast to much earlier on in the season, the first couple of games where he was kind of bad defensively, to say the least. And then Nick Merkley, who has been a very pleasant surprise for the San Jose Sharks over these past few games. He may have even played himself into a spot with the San Jose Sharks roster still, even when the Sharks get fully healthy. We'll see what ends up being the case in that situation, but he certainly has been good enough for that, even added an assist in tonight's game, playing on the Sharks, I guess you could say, first power play unit. On the fourth line as well, also quite impressive for the San Jose Sharks, it was Lane Peterson who would fill in as the fourth line center, and he would be joined by John Leonard, stepping in as the 13th forward with William Eklund now gone, as well as Jonah Gadjevich. I felt like in particular Leonard and Peterson stuck out in a very, very good way. Peterson, just after an abysmal start to this season where you're wondering how is this guy even still on the Sharks roster and not being sent down or at least being healthy scratched, he has been significantly better ever since the Sharks have actually run into these COVID problems. Likely a coincidence, but maybe just because he's been, given a slightly larger role than he had previously, that he's been able to sort of live up to that, but definitely been much better, not only defensively, which was a huge issue early on, but also offensively, shown off some pretty nice skills over these past few games. Leonard, who had a very disappointing game a couple of games ago when he was brought up for that one against the Buffalo Sabres, looked much better here tonight. As I said, he had 2 posts in that first period, so very, very close. Ended up becoming a bit less effective as the game went on, but that's mostly because his ice time decreased so significantly as the game went on. Didn't even manage to hit the double-digit mark in terms of minutes for the game here tonight. Gadjevich, I would say, was probably the weakest member on that fourth line, but that's not saying a ton. I still thought he was pretty good. Actually had a very good chance off of a strong John Leonard pass to him to get the Sharks a goal and beat Jonathan Bernier, but would end up getting robbed in that situation. Moving on to the defensive side of things, as we take a look once again at Burns and Ferraro, still the only 2 NHL regulars here in the lineup, and they were absolutely driven into the ground here tonight. Ferraro with over 31 minutes of ice time in tonight's game, and Burns with over 30 minutes himself. And this is, mostly because of the fact that when the Sharks went to overtime, John McLean's overtime strategy was to go from Burns to Ferraro to Burns to Ferraro to Burns and introduce none of the other Sharks defensemen into the fold there, which I guess ended up working out okay since neither team actually managed to score in the overtime. But that ended up significantly inflating the minutes of both Ferraro and Burns. But even so, if you were to just take regulation ice time, both of these players would have ended up with easily 27 to 28 to even 29 minutes in the case of Mario Ferraro. So still, these 2 players heavily being leaned on. Not a ton of trust is being put into the bottom 4 defensemen for the San Jose Sharks. So I guess in that regard, you're kind of hoping that some of these other defensemen for the San Jose Sharks, especially, that second pairing of Carlson and Middleton, can return to the lineup sooner rather than later, and they should be coming back at least some point during this upcoming road trip. On to the second pairing, it's actually Hataka returning to the lineup in favor of Kniazev. I thought Kniazev had done enough in that St. Louis Blues game to retain a lineup spot, and Miloš would end up getting taken out, but I guess Miloš has slight seniority over Kniazev, so he stayed in the lineup, and I guess it ended up not being too bad of a choice. Miloš was okay enough in this game. The player who did impress me on this pairing was actually Hataka. He did make that unfortunate mistake that would end up leading to the first goal for the New Jersey Devils in this game. However, otherwise, he showed a lot of confidence in this game, which was in stark contrast to his first NHL game just a few days ago, where he actually looked a lot more shaky. So that was definitely a good thing to see. You can see those elements of his game for why he actually ended up making it to the San Jose Sharks out of training camp, even though he only ended up making it as a seventh defenseman. And it'll definitely be somewhat interesting if maybe this game and future games can actually play a role in him getting a spot in the main lineup even when the Sharks are actually healthy. Moving on to the third and final pairing, Megna, not really too much to say about him. He was decently solid, kind of a fall from where he had been a couple of games ago against the Buffalo Sabres, but still not too bad. The player I do want to talk about, though, is Ryan Merkley, who after a bit of a struggle early on in this game, he actually managed to pick things up and was looking quite solid defensively throughout the majority of this game. I'd say about 45 to 50 minutes of this game, Merkley was making some very solid plays in the defensive zone, but then it was the crucial error in the last 3 minutes. He tries to just do a bit too much by himself. He doesn't really recognize that James Reimer, after making a big save behind him, is kind of scrambling to get back into position. Merkley should just be kind of swatting at this puck to get this out of pressure, even if the puck goes down in the ice for an icing, even if the puck is even kept in at the offensive zone blue line for the Devils. You just need to clear it out of pressure, but he tries to carry it out himself. He ends up getting punished by Kuokkanen, who scores the game-tying goal, and eventually the Sharks do not end up getting the extra point because of the shootout loss. So Merkley, it's a rookie mistake. He's going to learn from that. But if you can look past that big mistake that he did make late in this game, I actually thought he didn't look half bad. But unlike Hataka, who could potentially have worked himself into the conversation for when the Sharks are fully healthy, Merkley will absolutely be returning back to the AHL once the Sharks can get some members back into the lineup. And finally, to talk about the goaltending, James Reimer steps back here between the pipes instead of Adin Hill, who had a rough outing against the St. Louis Blues just a couple of nights ago. And Reimer once again putting up a great performance for the San Jose Sharks. He had absolutely no chance on either of these two Devils goals. He basically just is kind of not out of position, but he's the Sharks just not really defending well. As I said, Ryan Merkley, poor defense, poor mistakes on that last goal, as well as the one that's just kind of a great pass to allow Ryan Graves to score on the blocker side for Reimer. Just doesn't have enough time to be able to slide across. Otherwise, Reimer was making some really solid saves, and I think the biggest thing about Reimer compared to Adin Hill is, of course, that rebound control that I've harped on so much thus far this season, because when it comes to Adin Hill and some of the bad goals he lets in. For instance, the third goal of a couple nights ago against the St. Louis Blues, Brandon Saad's goals. Those are the things that can be cleaned up a bit, but this rebound control seemingly is a pretty hard-stuck issue for Adin Hill. And when you take a look at the game here from Reimer tonight, how many shots did we see come from the point or even just come from the slot or from the top of the face-off circle, and that James Reimer would just absorb? There was this one play, I believe it was back in the first period, it was a 3-on-2 for the New Jersey Devils, and the shot comes and Reimer makes the save, there's a rebound, but he's able to direct it into the corner completely out of trouble, compared to Adin Hill could have potentially ended up making the save there and then deflecting this rebound right up the middle for a Devils player to get a great chance on. So Reimer just so much more secure, and he makes me, and I'm sure a lot of other Sharks fans, much more feeling safe when he is between the pipes compared to Adin Hill, who is a bit more unpredictable at this point with some of the bad goals that he's been letting in and some of the massive rebounds that he has been giving up. So when it comes moving on into the road trip and into the future for the San Jose Sharks this season, Reimer seems, in my eyes at the very least, to have won the starting job, at least for the time being. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday. They will take on the Calgary Flames, who have been absolutely dominant thus far this season. Just tonight, while the Sharks were in this game losing 3-2 to the Devils in a shootout, the Calgary Flames were just dominating the New York Rangers with a win of 6-0. So the Sharks absolutely will have their work cut out for them. Hopefully some players at the very least can return to the lineup, because then, unless the Sharks can really pull out one of their best efforts of the season, it could end up looking like a bit of an ugly game. Class dismissed.